And welcome back to our panel discussion, The Catalyst for the Government's Big Data Revolution, sponsored by NetApp and CDWG here on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. Our guests today are Lee Vorthman, the Chief Technology Officer for Federal Civilian Agencies at NetApp U.S. Public Sector, Jack Nichols, Solutions Architect at CDWG, David Bray, the CIO of the Federal Communications Commission, John Montel, Electronic Records Manager in the Office of the CIO at the Interior Department, and Terry Halvorsen, the CIO of the Department of the Navy. And David Bray, I wanted to ask you the first question regarding applications, because the application strategy of an agency backs up to the way the data centers and infrastructure are architected to serve up data to those applications. So give us an idea of what your overall application strategy looks like. We can talk about mobility there also, which is kind of an FCC mission as well as an FCC strategy for its own purposes. So tell us what's going on there.
That's a great question, Tom. So since arriving at the FCC, used the first 6 months to do a survey of what did we have, do the listening and learning tour. And again, it was clear that we had applications that had basically minimal investment over the last 8 or 9 years. In fact, there are some that have not been getting any tender loving care for more than 10 years.
A lot of Windows 95 still around.
Fortunately, there, huh? The good news is since then we're only at 3% XP. So that was one of the first things when I arrived that we quickly, we've gone to Windows 7. The bigger thing is we have a lot of Power Builder. Fortunately, no COBOL or anything like that, but we do have Power Builder. We have probably some Borland Paradox too.
So you're an archaeologist.
Yes. The FCC is in, and so I often think that what we're doing is less of a revolution and more is just modernization of the FCC. And the theory I have is organizations always do great on the front end, what they may sometimes neglect on the inside. So we do now have a chairman that actually gets it, and we're making the movement. Our application strategy, because the FCC has to deal with a lot of policy-related activities, and oftentimes there's a need for evidence-based policy, is what can we do to make the data in our applications as agile as possible so that when a commissioner asks a question or when we're going to have a commission hearing, it could be that we have less than 48 hours to actually do all the analysis that we need to do to actually then present that data. And so we're fond of tools like MongoDB, other sort of agile tools that allow us to quickly make the analyses and then present that. And so that's what we're doing on the in-house. And the nice thing about the commission is we do have an op tempo where every month we do have to have a public hearing. We have to get the agenda out in advance. And so we want to move to evidence-based policy that we're doing with our data. On the outside, the FCC website still has many different subdomains. We still have some subdomains that look like, quite frankly, they were built in front page 98, and they may have been. And so trying to use data analytics as well as focus groups to identify the most used parts of the website, both the old and the new, and then have that go forward. We should have a responsive website. After all, we are the FCC. It should look good on a tablet, should look good on a phone. And also for everything that we do, wherever possible, have an open API that people can pull from. And so it's not just that FCC is making its data used to itself, but then people can pull from it. And it may be in the future, it's actually a two-way street. We may work with our partners and they may have data. They already submit data manually for licenses. One of the things that absolutely blew my mind is the FCC is still using paper-based complaint forms. And you would think that, again, we could probably move to the 20th century and use web-based and maybe go even further with web-based. And so I think our cost savings with both data and applications, when I get asked this question, will become from making non-IT processes that are very inefficient right now and very unproductive, making them much more productive. And what I look for is whenever we engage in an effort is please show me the as-is process and desired to be, and then we'll figure out the IT that goes on top of that.
And what about mobility? Because you mentioned the APIs, and those are really important to mobile apps, which
yes.
tend to be agnostic of the data that they're pulling from because they combine things in new ways. So is there a mobility overlay here?
Yes. In fact, mobile is key to our strategy. We're looking at our field offices having mobile apps that they could use for their purposes and actually have a secure kernel. We're also looking at mobile apps. I mentioned the FCC speed test app as a way of engaging the public that if they choose to be, they can actually provide data that actually talks about their connection speed to actually do that evidence-based policy. And we like the agnostic nature of apps because, again, it may be that we're sharing the data with the public or the public sharing data with us. It can actually be a two-way street. I'm a firm believer that now that the internet is becoming more accessible and more ubiquitous, we can do things that historically had to be done by DC or had to be done by government can now be this broader definition of the public sector can do it, and whether it's citizens or public-private partnerships, there were things that we used to do in government that we can now actually engage others in doing.
Okay, and Jack, I wanted to ask you from CDWG's standpoint as a company that's supporting a lot of mobility efforts commercially and in the government, are there things that agencies can do to jumpstart their way to get toward a more mobility strategy without years and years of effort?
Sure. I think it's a great question, Tom. And I think one of the first steps is really to assess your environment. And that's probably the most important thing, is that really gives you some sense of direction as to what's possible in your particular environment as it relates to your users, your technology, your applications. And, in my mind, that's always a great first step. From there, we can look at what's possible from a technology standpoint. Lee mentioned earlier some newer emerging technologies, and all those things can come to bear once you have that. But really, an assessment is probably the very key first step to finding out, getting a foundation for what direction you want to go.
And so that assessment would also look at APIs and data sources and making sure they're mobile ready, I guess.
Absolutely. So everything from the very basic infrastructure to the APIs and the applications in use.
The Navy is mobile in the sense forever. It's had platforms that go places. And I guess mobile communications used to be flag waving at one point. Now it's a little more sophisticated in the Navy. But tell us about application strategy and also how mobility might be affecting that and how it backs up to the data.
So, Tom, I'm going to talk about that. So first of all, I don't have an application strategy. I have an overall data strategy. And I think if you're not thinking that way, you're going to miss the boat. Certainly, applications drive the use for the demand signal for users. They're using apps. They're using systems. But you still have to go back to ask yourself some basic questions. And one of the basic questions is, what apps have to be mobile? Which really you're asking, what data has to be mobile? Not all data has to be mobile. Not all data should be mobile environment. You also have to take a look from our standpoint today. I have a list of things I want to make more mobile. What's the priority on that list? Because I'll tell you, the question that takes most of my time today, what am I not going to spend money on? This is a different DoD posture than, say, 5-6 years ago. We are really focused on what not to spend money on. So that means you have to make different priority decisions. So what are my mission requirements that drive my data requirements to say this has to go mobile? Where are my apps that are okay? I mean, I always don't want to be on the leading edge. I mean, we talked a little bit about COBOL. I have apps that are in COBOL, and I'm quite happy with them. As a matter of fact, lots of business have apps that are in COBOL. Big, large processing for personnel, finance. Most industries still are around COBOL. It's not the same COBOL that I learned to program on, thank God, but it's modernized. And that's going to last a while, and that's fine. There are other apps that are in that no, it's not so fine, and we need to, again, what's the data value that's driving me? And data value, I think, is a topic we don't spend enough time on. What's the value of the data? And I think one of the things we're finding is, frankly, we have some data that doesn't have much value. It doesn't need to be mobile. It doesn't need to be anywhere. We need to go and eliminate the data. That's going to drive us to eliminating some apps. We have more apps than we need in the Navy. I think we've made a big push, Department Navy-wide, to get reduced apps. We're probably down to under 6,000. That's still too many.
I mean, the way you describe this is the opposite of how it's usually described. Yeah. I remember early in the 90s and early 2000s, the whole idea was getting rid of applications, but you're looking at it from getting rid of data.
I think you have to, because people built applications. I mean, we can look at applications. Some people will say that application was done. Somebody built that for a reason. Most of it was a reason they wanted to get access to some element of data.
Even though that ship might have been scrapped 30 years ago, the app's still there.
The app, but remember, the data that it was supporting is probably still around. Mm-hmm. I mean, we built apps to get to data, manipulate data, get to solution sets. So the requirement for that app may not have gone away. The reason how that app works may have gone away, but we don't know that until we ask the question about the value of the data. Are there some data pieces we don't need? Right. And if we get that list, then you can start looking, well, look, all these apps had this big data that we didn't need. So can we now say, okay, if I've got 60, 70% of the data not needed that app was manipulating, or the way it manipulating is wrong, then that's an app to target to kill. And just get rid of it and move on. But the other piece of that I think you have to be willing to do, and I said that earlier, is you're probably going to have to get an enterprise behavior that says, you know what, today, in our initial move, we're going to move some apps, we're going to collapse it, and that app, our new set of apps and systems, or the new way we get to your data, initially may answer 85% of your requirement, 80% of your requirement. You're going to have to live with that for a while. as we move to the 100%, as it takes us time to prioritize the funding. And that's, you heard some of the other partners say, that is a cultural change. It's a cultural change about who owns the data, and frankly, it's a cultural change about how we're going to use the data, and that is a big element of any change. So there's a cultural issue to all this, because you're now trying to treat the data more at the true enterprise level than at each of, in my case, say the sub-company or sub-corporation level.
So would it be too far to say that maybe you should almost never destroy data, but maybe just store it in a way that it's there if you need it someday? Because, as you said, originally it was needed for something.
Yeah, I think what you do is you initially move the data that you find it low relevancy for, low value for, into a cheaper, in many cases offline storage. Do your further analysis, and you'll find some data that you can absolutely just, electronically kill. But you do need to be careful. And of course, in the federal government and within DoD, the requirements about what data you must store, your records requirements, are a little bit more rigorous than, say, what's in the public sector. So it will take you a little more analysis to decide what to kill. So park it in a box somewhere that's the cheapest way you can find to store it. Do that further analysis, but get it off your systems.
All right, so Lee, you might be a good one to follow up that question with a question about storage hierarchy. That's always been an issue for people in charge of managing data, is how do you store it so that you can get it when you need to, but not pay for right there kind of data, or there's not enough memory in the world for that. So what are the up-to-date strategies for managing data in a way that Terry just described?
Sure. Well, so first I want to say I think Terry and I are going to become fast friends, because we have similar views on the data world in terms of making sure we classify it to get the best use out of it. But in terms of storing it, right, if we go back to kind of the first segment where we talked about, data center modernization and consolidation, and certainly the trends around virtualization, we're seeing the demand for, once you classify your data and figure out your use cases, for trying to put it into this, if you will, federated pool, and that's really going to give you the most cost savings and most optimization out of the data. And what that does for you is, so for example, in Terry's case, it lets you move the data where you need it to be non-disruptively. It lets you put it into certain, performance pools or long-term archive pools. The government obviously has very strict requirements for how long they need to keep their data. So it gives you this flexibility as we talk about virtualizing the technology more and more, software-defined X, right? It gives you this flexibility to move that data into the tiers that you need it to be in.
And also, there's different options now for physical storage media than
Absolutely.
there were, say, 10 or 12 years ago?
Yeah, so obviously, the densities of storage are going up, so you now have the option to have very, very long-term archives on the floor of your data centers. You also have solid state that's now in the mainstream, right? So you have the option for very, very high-performance flash technologies. You have virtualized, versions of storage instances, if you will. When we talk about cloud, how can you get the best data to where you need it to be? So there's a lot of options out there, and certainly, our customers, as we heard, are trying to figure out how they can best take advantage of it.
All right, John, and when I see Interior Department, I see a bundle of really sub-agencies and missions, and they're geographically scattered. So how do you reconcile all that from an application standpoint and from a data standpoint?
Yeah, one of the initiatives that we started in 2012 was to consolidate all of the records in the department. So we're working to consolidate about 37 independent systems. But as the department consolidated its email, for instance, from Exchange and Lotus Notes, and was awarded a contract through Google Apps for Government, we initiated a program to begin capturing all that email. And so you're talking about 800 plus million emails a year. And I totally agree that when it comes to virtualization of that data, there's a very finite number of data that you need to present to the user externally or while they're mobile. We're also addressing that from a forms perspective. We're taking over 28,000 forms and automating those into a full HTML5 environment so that they're, where you go, you can get access to that data. And it's also available to the citizen. But again, very carefully, we're taking a look at, now that we're amassing this data, we can analyze it, look at it, and more understand what do we need from the business perspective, what do we have to present to the user, what can be on long-term storage, what can be on hot storage, and what do we don't need. Do we need to keep things for 10,000 years? I'm not quite sure. There's a bona fide need for that, and so we have to understand that and work with other agencies, National Archives and OMB, and our partners to better realize what we're doing and why we're doing it, and is there really a bona fide need.
All right, well, that brings us to our next break. Our guests today are Jack Nichols, the solutions architect at CDWG, David Bray, CIO of the Federal Communications Commission, John Montel, electronic records manager in the Office of the CIO at the Interior Department, Terry Halvorsen, CIO of the Department of the Navy, and Lee Vorthman, the Chief Technology Officer for Federal Civilian Agencies at NetApp U.S. Public Sector. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin, on the catalyst for the government's big data revolution, a panel discussion sponsored by NetApp and CDWG here on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. We'll be right back.